So thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to be on. Which questioning was it?
Funny enough, it hit all angles. It was the one where you were talking about the kill list, and then you segued into us funding Al-Qaeda in Syria. And it was that the whole 7-minute clip where you actually got to fire off a couple of questions before they shooed you out. So.
Oh, good. So you played the whole thing. That's terrific.
Absolutely. So without further ado, everybody, kind of an impromptu introduction of Ben Swann. Let me pull up his bio really quick. I have my show notes here. Ben Swann spent 14 years working as a journalist in broadcast news, and he didn't want to bore you with the information. He won the Edward R. Murrow Award twice, I believe, and 2 Emmys also. And then he spent a year in Mexico covering the war on drugs and the so-called United States War on Drugs. And most of you will know him from my podcast, From Reality Check, where I used to feature his segments regularly because he tackled real issues with real questions and did some true journalism. So once again, thank you, Ben Swann, for coming on.
Well, thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. A kind introduction.
Well, thank you, sir. Now, the one thing I wanted to touch on at the very beginning was just to give us some background. How did you get into media?
Well, I actually got into it as a news photographer because I needed the job. It's not exactly a terribly exciting story, but I just had 3 brothers who were news photographers and was looking for work, and one of them suggested I do it, and I said, I have no interest in doing that, guys. Really, no interest. But they pushed me, and so I started doing it and really enjoyed it. Enjoyed kind of the shooting and editing process, and after a while, I really started to enjoy the time there. But then I got married and started having kids and said I need to make more money, and so I transitioned from being a photographer to actually being a reporter, which is kind of a difficult jump to make. A lot of folks don't make that jump. It's kind of a left brain, right brain kind of a thing. So, but I did do that and was able to do so successfully, and then enjoyed the reporting side of it. So it's kind of all grown from there, but really started out getting into the business out of necessity above anything else.
Now, here's a question I've wanted to ask. I have a friend of mine that works at CNN, and never really gotten him, I guess, cornered long enough to ask him this question, but can you explain to the audience what goes on behind the scenes at just your average run-of-the-mill broadcast? Like, who decides what's going to go on air, what segments are produced, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the way it works, especially in a local affiliate, you have assignment meetings every single day where lots of stories come into a newsroom, and they come in a variety of different ways. The majority of them, though, candidly, come in through news releases that are sent out from either the city or from, a local police department. And so a lot of that kind of fills up what we call the planner. You also have different reporters who will bring ideas. You have folks who are watching what other media are doing locally. And then on top of all of that, most TV stations are affiliates of some network. So you might be a CBS affiliate or a Fox affiliate, a CNN affiliate. And so you'll also have stories that will come down on wires. And so there are producers who will go through all that information, and reporters, and they go through all of it, and they decide what they want to fill up a newscast with each day. And exactly how those decisions are made, typically, I believe, and this is just my opinion, but I believe most of those decisions are made because of kind of a group think. This is how we do it. This is what we always do. And so in the 1990s and the 80s, there was a phrase they use a lot with TV stations: if it bleeds, it leads. And so the philosophy was, if someone gets shot or someone is murdered, that's always the lead story, because that's what people care about. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it all shifted to weather. If there is severe weather or disruptive weather, that's what leads, because they assume that's what people care about, and part of that's the results of TV consultants. So there's kind of a process to it of how it all comes together, but I'm not sure that a lot of people in the business understand why we do what we do anymore. They just kind of go along and do it.
So is it just talking points disseminated down from, I'm sure to a certain extent, but talking points disseminated down from, like you said, the flagship station or something like that, and then picked up and then regurgitated by the local media? Is that what you're just some portions? I would assume, correct?
So I don't think it's so much even that it's talking points. In some cases, especially national news, it's just scripts that come down. So a script will come down, and local affiliate will pick it up and they'll run with it. And they don't even question it because it comes from the network, so it comes from an official source. A lot of that news, though, and where you start to get into whether or not that news is accurate, is the point of view that's taken. Because even though a lot of folks will say, well, no, it's just straight news, it's not just straight news. There's kind of a point of view that fits into a lot of it. So, for instance, I interviewed a guy recently who created an app called Ghetto Tracker.
Okay.
And
yeah,
Ghetto Tracker, is essentially an app that just, allows users to say what part of town they're in when visiting an area, a city, and they rate the area. Is it a good area, bad area? Do I feel comfortable being here? And essentially it's set up for when you're visiting areas or cities that you don't know well to decide whether or not you know what part of town to stay in. If you go to hotels.com, he says, for instance, you might see a hotel has 3 stars. That doesn't mean it's in a bad area. It might just mean it's a bad hotel. You might have good hotels, but they're close to bad areas. So that's the idea behind it. Well, the guy's story, the day that they kind of released the beta test on the website, it got picked up by some media. And immediately there was this claims of how he had this racist app that was designed to keep whites and blacks apart, keep the rich and the poor apart, and that it was classist and all these things. But the fascinating part is, and I'm sure your listeners have seen this, when Conan O'Brien makes fun of broadcasters, and they're all reading the exact same script on the exact same day, we've all seen that. Well, that happens all the time because, for instance, in his case, CNN writes a wire story about it, and it goes out to all the CNN affiliates. And all the affiliates pick it up, and they copy and paste that text into their story, and it runs in their newscast. And so the viewer at home thinks that the local station discovered this app and is reporting about this app. But they didn't. In fact, the local guys at the local station don't even bother to ever even check and see whether or not the app is an app. And it wasn't an app at the time. It was just a website. There was no app that had been created. They didn't know anything about it. But that's very typical. There's this desire to get a lot of content out, and so you're just grabbing information, you're trusting that it's accurate, and everybody's running with it as if it is official or gospel.
Or straight from the horse's mouth, as you would say. Okay. Now, when talking about your experiences with the war on drugs, was that an eye-opener for you, seeing how the media would spin it, or maybe wire stories involving something like that, and then what you were seeing was contradicting what was going on in the media?
Define contradictory.
Let's see. Maybe the point of view wasn't the proper point of view to really hone in on what the war on drugs was doing to the United States. Instead, honing in on the problem of, well, we're arresting all these people instead of having the overall worldview, I guess, of maybe this isn't such a good thing to have guys going around and enforcing such laws when it was a failed policy from the get-go.
Right. Yeah, I think the issue here is we have these archetypes, right, that are kind of built to society. And I think what we see today is that media operates on a very, very basic, almost primitive level. They're always looking for the lowest common denominator. And so we have certain narratives in media that I think are commonly used. So, for instance, drugs equals bad. Okay?
Right.
So if you report that someone was arrested or someone had drugs on them, that equals they're a bad person. They're a criminal. And so there are these kind of things that go along with it. Well, the problem, of course, with it is when you automatically begin to create a narrative, and whoever's creating it, you create the narrative, and now all of a sudden you can't have a very reasonable discussion about drug policy, about drug laws, about the fact that there are lots of people who are locked up in prisons in America, and they've only committed a crime, if you want to call it a crime, against themselves. I mean, they're choosing to put a substance in their body that government has deemed as illegal, but there are other chemicals they're allowed to put into their bodies that if they buy them from a very expensive pharmaceutical company, it's perfectly acceptable. So we don't really question those things because the narrative speaks for us. The narrative tells us that certain things are okay and certain things are not, and so we don't really have to get into the details and look at the realities of these decisions, because instead we're so busy just kind of playing the narrative. People who get arrested are clearly they're bad people, and the people who are abusing drugs, they're bad people. Drugs themselves are bad and harmful to children, and so we will have that conversation, but we don't have the intelligent conversation about the fact that alcohol is, in many cases, much more detrimental to society than marijuana is, and yet it's perfectly legal. So
absolutely,
but it requires the effort, right? It requires the effort of having that conversation and actually knowing something about what you're talking about.
Right, and if anybody does any research on it, and I've posted it on my website and posted it on Facebook a couple of times, where they even have graphs on which is most detrimental to you and which is most harmful to society, and right at the top of the list is alcohol, both in detrimental to you and detrimental to society. So it is one of those, situations where they've created a narrative, and then we can't challenge the narrative because that would open up a whole different can of worms. So shifting a little bit, I saw that you wrote an article yesterday in taking on the Navy shooter and bringing up the fact that most of the time when events like this happen, mass shootings happen, these people are on SSRIs and they do have mental instability. I want you to expand on that, and also why the mainstream media steers clear of bringing this to light and creating a debate out of it.
Well, I think it's unfortunate, and I actually got quite a bit of criticism from some different libertarians, in fact, who were angry that I even brought the issue up and said, well, see, you're just playing into conspiracy stuff, and there's no evidence that this was involved. Listen, I'm not saying there's evidence. As you read the article, then you know that we're not saying there's any evidence. In fact, I specifically say in the article, it's irresponsible to claim that this is the cause of these shootings. It's also irresponsible to not consider that the narratives, we've been talking about narratives tonight, the narrative that the left always goes to is the propensity of guns, the availability of guns, and therefore, if we could just take away guns from people, these shootings wouldn't happen. They always go to that narrative. It was so quick to go to that narrative that we had media immediately reporting that an AR-15 rifle was used, and then having to backtrack and say, well, it turns out actually it wasn't used. And by the way, if you go and read the CNN Online article, CNN writes an entire article explaining that no AR-15 rifle was used, and then says, but it was often used in these other shootings, and it lists all these other shootings.
It's always the back of the paper end of the article kind of deal where it's like, oh, never mind. Well, what we really meant was this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it goes on to this whole thing of talking about other shootings. But the left always goes to that. And then on the right, they always go to this idea that, well, clearly this must be an Al-Qaeda plot, a Muslim extremist who, he hates America and that's why he's doing this. And they immediately turn to that narrative. And in this case, it's an African-American man, so they say, oh, wow, he's African-American, so he must be an Al-Qaeda supporter, and maybe he's an American Muslim. It turns out he kind of attended a Buddhist temple, but he wasn't even really a Buddhist. He was attending a Buddhist temple. But when you you break down those narratives, and now everyone's scrambling, and I keep seeing the word mystery. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but the word mystery is used over and over when talking about this guy. What's the mystery? Why would he do this? The one area that nobody discusses is the fact that when you talk about Adam Lanza and Sandy Hook, when you talk about this shooter, yes, it's Aaron Alexis, the Navy Air shooter, when you talk about many of these guys, and James Holmes is the same thing also, by the way, there are all kinds of reports about the use of some kind of medication for depression or for some kind of mental health issue.
Correct.
And so I don't think it's unreasonable to say, if we're seeing this, why is it that CNN is so quick to say, well, we need to track how many AR-15s are involved in these so that we can try to tie it to that, and never mention the fact that a lot of these people are on medication. And does that have a role? I can't say that it does, but I can say we should at least look at that. It's not unreasonable to look at that.
Absolutely, and it's just, that's just looking at the facts and then making an informed decision on, if, like you said, if you laid them all out on a spreadsheet, on an Excel spreadsheet, the mass shootings that have happened over the last couple of years, you're exactly right. In almost every incident, even back to Columbine, they have people that have, mental stability issues. So, and I understand where the background checks come from, and they would like to look at, mental health, and that becomes a slippery slope, and I get all of that. But I do think that there needs to be a discussion going on around the country, and I actually posted something to Facebook, and I said that, America might have a mental illness problem disguised as a gun problem, because it's turning into the people that have mental instability will go and will get guns, and typically won't be, a gun that they go buy at the store. It'll be something they got from a third party, and then they go out and commit these atrocities, and then, like you said, it's the two default narratives take place, and then we end up in the same place that we were, instead of having an intelligent discussion and saying, well, maybe there's something to this, but let's at least rule it out first before we start jumping to all these other hypotheticals.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's very reasonable, and again, the issue is too, is the mental health issue being made worse by certain types of drugs. Look, the fact is we have a society right now that is doped up on something, and it seems like everybody is. Everybody seems to be taking something. And, we talk a lot about these mass shootings and how we're seeing an increase of them, and the media talks about this a lot. They say there's this increase in mass shootings. So even though they're still, statistically much lower than just gun violence or violent crime in general, that these are, kind of a small percentage, they are becoming more frequent. That is true. But the reasons they give for that, the accessibility they say to guns is untrue. But what we are seeing is more and more people medicated, more and more people on medication from a much younger age. So I think it's a fair question to say, is there, something that's happening with the psychosis of these people that's causing them to react this way? And by the way, another issue that media keeps bringing up are video games and saying, well, what about these video games? He will like to play Call of Duty. They said this about Adam Lanza as well. He was in his basement playing video games a lot. Why is it more responsible to talk about whether or not there's a connection to video games than to talk about whether or not there's a connection to the drugs these people are putting in their body?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things I addressed. I don't know if you were listening before you came on, but one of the things I addressed also is that I am a gamer, but it doesn't encompass my life like these guys. I consider these guys to be, losers in my category, but I do play Call of Duty, and like I said before, I play it just to basically shoot zombies. It's nothing more than that to me. So to equate that to something that millions of people a day log on to Call of Duty, and nobody goes out and shoots anybody, and to equate that, like you were saying, to this being one of the issues, or possibly the driving force that drove him to go kill people, is I think unethical and irresponsible. I would 100% agree with you on that. So here's transitioning into some other fun topics. 9/11. You made an incredible video about 9/11, and can you just explain to the audience what you uncovered by making that? I think it was a 14-minute video or whatever. What you uncovered by talking to these people, and what you believe the discussions should be, or should we reopen the investigation?
Well, it's interesting because we did this piece, and it's had over 200,000 views in a week on YouTube, and a lot of people talking about it, some very negatively and some very positively. The main thing we wanted to do was talk about the issue that, unfortunately, you're not allowed to talk about in this country. And yet, one of the things we looked at is the fact that statistically new polls show that more and more Americans just do not believe the official narrative about 9/11. That doesn't mean they all agree on what happened. Doesn't mean that they all agree that Dick Cheney was hiding in the basement with bombs, which some people believe, and that's fine. But and as you watch the piece, we don't draw any conclusions. But what we talk about is the fact that when NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, released their report on how Building 7 came down in 2008, there was information in there that was structurally incorrect. Now, I wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that. As lay people, we don't know these things. But there is a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth who have 2,000, okay, not two, but 2,000 professional architects and engineers, mechanical engineers, civil engineers, structural engineers, who have signed on saying that the way that NIST claims the building came down is impossible. Could not have come down this way. They claim it had to have been a controlled demolition. Now, again, I don't know if that's true, but I believe this. I believe that as a journalist, we have an obligation to hear people who are saying, I have expertise in this field, I have degrees in this field, I've worked in this field my entire career, and I'm telling you, this doesn't work, and there should be, they say, a new investigation, an independent investigation into how that building came down. Now, again, as a journalist, my job is not to decide whether they're right or not, but to at least give them, the opportunity to be heard. And it's very sad to me that still in America, we don't want to give anyone a platform to speak if we disagree with them on this issue. But more Americans are moving away from that. And so, for your listeners who have not seen it, if you go to benswann.com, you can check it out. I encourage you to do so. I encourage you to watch it, though, and don't watch it expecting me to be a truther and to convince you that it was all a big conspiracy. But just watch it with an open mind to the idea that maybe in the past 12 years, our government has lied to us about some things. And so if professionals are telling us that there's something wrong with the story, maybe we should look into it. And that's all we really address. But I think it's important that we do address those issues.
And I interviewed, actually met him at a Liberty event. I interviewed Richard Gage, the president and head of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and he went into great detail on Building 7. And like you said, you and I, the lay people, I could never get there in a million years, but he broke it down pretty succinctly. And I take the same stance that you do. I don't believe that I know what happened. I don't believe in a conspiracy. And my philosophy behind my entire show is to just get people to think and get people to question, which is what it seems like that your show and that your videos and your investigations that you pull up basically do that, and that's to just challenge the narrative, challenge where these people are getting these sources from, where the information is coming from. And that's actually an interesting segue into my next question about freedom of the press here in America. And that's our First Amendment right, but right now we have people in Washington, D.C. that would like to, I guess, rubber stamp, or I don't know what the proper terminology would be, put you on the good boy list to be a quote-unquote journalist. And I know that you as an independent journalist, and me also, I guess I would be considered independent media, I have some issues with that, and I know that you've taken a stance on that. So explain to the audience what's going on in Washington and what they're kind of kicking around as ideas to, I guess, better transport the narrative to the people.
Yeah, well, it all actually comes from a discussion over Shield law. So if you don't know what that is, essentially if a reporter interviews someone who is a whistleblower, so an Edward Snowden, a Bradley Manning, and you interview someone and you get information, government can come to you and say, you've got to tell us who's telling you this, you've got to tell us where you got the information from, you got to turn over anything you have to reveal your sources to us. And so what SHIELD laws do is they say, no, there's a separation of powers here, and government under the Constitution does not have the right, with a free press to be able to compel them to give up their sources. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so a shield law is exactly that. It protects the journalist. Now, in my opinion, my humble opinion, we don't need shield laws because we have a constitution that says you can't do this, right? But we have freedom of press. But of course, government always wants to make a law in order to protect something because they're actually taking away something.
Correct.
So in this case, they're setting up a shield law in order to protect journalists and then trying through this process to define what a journalist actually is and who actually qualifies to be a journalist. So Senator Dianne Feinstein and Senator Chuck Schumer are among those who were saying, well, you know, the journalist is someone who is a professional journalist, someone who works for a news-gathering organization. They've expanded out to citizen journalists, they say, and some student journalists. However, Dianne Feinstein says she cannot just, you know, extend the privilege of being a journalist to some 17-year-old with a blog.
Oh, yeah.
She says if Edward Snowden, she says, were to go online and start his own website and had started putting this information up, he would claim he was a journalist. And she says, I can't give him that kind of privilege. Now notice the language used there. The language is, I cannot give him that privilege. And they're taking what is a constitutional right. It's in the Bill of Rights. It is our very first right given to us is to have freedom of speech, religion, and the free press. And she is instead calling it a privilege, something government bestows upon a few people and has the right to take away.
It's amazing, isn't it? And then they use the wordplay like leaker instead of whistleblower because a whistleblower is protected under SHIELD law, correct? And then a leaker is somebody that is not protected. Is that correct under the 1980s whistleblower law?
That's right. 1989, the Whistleblower Protection Act protects any government employee who reveals any illegal activity in a government agency. And by the way, it's fascinating to talk about the collusion between media and government. The Associated Press contacted all of its, after the whole Edward Snowden thing blew up, contacted all of its affiliates and said, do not refer to Edward Snowden as a whistleblower. He's a leaker. And so that actually came from the Associated Press telling other media not to refer to him as a whistleblower because he's not. Now, we did a piece on this. It was one of the very first reality checks that we did independently. And that piece talks about the fact that this is a simple issue. It's a simple issue because there's a legal standard. Did Edward Snowden reveal something that government was doing that was illegal? And you're easily able to prove that, yes, even under the FISA Act, even under the Patriot Act, the NSA was and continues to violate the rights of American citizens and to go beyond what legally has been granted to them. There's no question. But media doesn't play that game. Instead, they play the game of, well, we're going to decide that he's a leaker because, you know, we've decided he's not what he's not. He's not a whistleblower because if they call him that, he gets that legal protection.
Right, and then they go and parade him around, and then they say, is it, you know, then they have the proverbial infighting of the information that he's leaking, which was all, the majority of it was all public anyway, but, you know, they want to make the spectacle of it. Is he a traitor to the country, or is he, you know, is he a whistleblower? So they basically shift and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I got out of it. They shift the argument from whether he is a true leaker or a whistleblower to is he a traitor or is he a whistleblower, correct?
That's right. That's exactly what it turns into. It becomes, is he a good person or is he a bad person?
God, it always boils down to that simple fact, huh? It's just like this is good or bad, kind of like what you said before. It's just very almost Neanderthalic. It's either good or bad, correct?
That's exactly right. And that's what it ultimately comes down to. And media loves those kinds of very simplistic narratives because they feel much better about kind of this process. And it's a mess in that there are things in media that are facts, but we treat them like opinions. And there are things that are opinions and they're treated like facts. And it becomes so convoluted that the average viewer or listener can't tell the difference anymore. They really cannot tell the difference between opinion and fact on television. And one of the things that happens is that I think we've allowed the public as a whole to play into this, and the public, I believe, does not watch media anymore to be informed. The majority of people watch media in order to have their worldview validated. So they already hold a certain belief. They go to Fox, they turn on the TV, and they say, validate my belief. Tell me that what I'm thinking is true. They go to CNN and say, tell me what I'm thinking is true. They go to MSNBC and say, tell me what I'm thinking is true. And if the talking head or the reporter or whoever it is on any of those channels says something that the viewer disagrees with, not because they say, oh, well, you don't have your facts right, but because you don't fit their preconceived narrative, then the viewer's angry. And the viewer's frustrated. I don't believe you. You need to validate what I came here to hear.
Exactly. Good gosh, it's so crazy, isn't it? I mean, I studied marketing for 4 years in college, so I guess I watch television a little bit differently than most people would. When I see a commercial, I don't see, the happy family. I see the manipulation that they're trying to push and why they picked the two people in the commercial that they did and why they put the setting the way they did and how to basically frame the product. So I guess that would lead me into my next question for you is, where do you see media going in the future?
Well, I think the rise of alternative media will continue as long as we don't get shut down by CISPA and some of those attempts at it. But I think there will be a continued rise of alternative media. There will be a continued rise of bloggers and journalists, and even sites like YouTube are so powerful because you really have people, and now a lot of it's funny stuff or silly stuff, but you have the ability today to bypass the traditional media outlets and get information to people in a way that just we've never had before in the history of humankind. Mm-hmm. And so it's very interesting to me that the time that we're living in, the collision of opportunity and technology all kind of coming together, I think you're going to see people become even better informed than they are now. I think government will continue to struggle. Secretary of State John Kerry, a few months ago, before all the Syria stuff blew up, had a statement that got very little coverage, but he had said that it was more difficult to govern today than at any time in history because of the Internet. Because he says, even during the Cold War, it was easier because the Soviets just controlled their people and told them what to think. He says, and at that time it was a lot easier. He says, now because of something called the Internet, it's very difficult to govern. Well, I wouldn't call it the Soviet Union was doing governing.
That's more dictation by numbers. Like, here, do this or we're going to shoot you.
That's right.
Or throw you in an internment camp. There you go.
Yeah, I'd say, but even that aside, he's absolutely right. And he wasn't saying it in a positive way necessarily, but I think he's absolutely right. I think it is very difficult to govern because people know more. So when you start telling people that we have to go to war with Syria, for instance, and that Assad was killing his own people, and he's the only one, and he's the bad guy with the black hat, and the good guys, the rebels, the freedom fighters with the white hats are coming, to get him, and the American public says, no, we don't believe you. And that's all because of, I think, the collision of alternative media and social media. Alternative media putting out good information, social media being the platform that's used to disseminate it. It's a very powerful combination.
Do you think that in the future that we'll see the cable network providers just become basically internet pipes for people, and that there will be no more cable television, and you'll be basically just subscribing to channels much like you would on YouTube, but on a grander scale, like any television show? I mean, look at Netflix and the platform that they've built. And creating their own, even, I guess they're up for Emmys or something like that, or a couple of their shows are up for Emmys because they're just really good content, but it's on an on-demand basis. Do you see that being an evolution of just the media in general, that the big dinosaurs will soon die off?
Eventually, I think they will. Now, some of them will probably adapt. They'll get people in there who will, kind of adapt to whatever the streaming model is. But eventually, cable itself will disappear. I mean, cable TV as we know it, at some point, I believe that our kids won't even understand what that was. The whole idea that, you had, channels here, and the whole idea of that analog system just doesn't make sense. So that will eventually go away. What takes its place remains to be seen. And I think there is going to be an interesting kind of fight, if you will, for information, because It's too powerful. Whoever has the influence over people has power. And so there are a lot of power brokers out there that want to control that. So I think there will be an interesting fight in store in the next few years and decades.
Now, got you for a few more minutes here, so let me ask you a question. This has kind of died off in the media, and I don't know how much research you've done into this, but why do you think that the mass media was so quick to dismiss Michael Hastings' death as a I guess, drug-induced suicide?
I don't know a lot about the Hastings case, other than the fact that it seems like there's a lot of issues there with it. I have not actually looked into it that much, so I really couldn't speak on that too much.
Well, that's fair, and it's one of those things that kind of was a flash pan in the media, and now it's kind of died off, and it doesn't seem like anybody's done any follow-up. So I was just going to kind of get your take on that. But let's move back into Syria, and what do you think is going to happen here with, like you said, the establishment's ability to basically control the population and disseminate the narrative down to the populace and get everybody rah-rah, the WMD model, which we basically saw propagated all over again. And now the American public's not buying it. What do you see is going to happen over there now that we've had this tremendous arms buildup in that region, and basically everybody's on, everybody's on a hold for right now? What do you see going on over there?
Well, I think eventually the U.S. will strike. I think that they were very surprised by how much more informed the public was. But I think it just says to them, we have to come up with a better narrative, because it really was the exact same script as Iraq in 2003. WMD's, talk. It was word for word the same thing. And so we find ourselves now, in a position where, again, the public is more informed. They don't want to do it. They're not interested. So you've got to create something else to draw the U.S. into it. I think that those in government who have decided that they want to do this, and they absolutely are not going to be stopped, will find a way to do it. But it will be very difficult. It's going to certainly be more difficult than it was to get into Iraq, which took absolutely no effort at all. The American people as a whole went along with it, despite the fact that there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever of WMDs. But we just didn't know better. We trusted, and I think 12 years after 9/11 and 10 years since we went into Iraq, that the American public is in a very different place. You got to remember, there are people now who are of voting age who were 10 years old, 8 years old when we went into Iraq. So you have an entire generation that's growing up knowing nothing but war around the world, and they're tired of it. They're really genuinely tired of it and ready to make some change happen.
Now, what happens when now that I guess the establishment has lost the control of the populace? I mean, is it another? I guess I don't want to say false flag, because that sounds really over the top, I guess. But we can't rule it out of these situations because it's happened in history. But you say that there are people, obviously people that listen to this show understand the military-industrial complex and how they have a very vested interest into selling new equipment and more weapons to foreign countries and to our own, into our own government. So how do they get us over there? I mean, here's a better question for you. Does Obama get impeached if he does this without Congress?
No. He won't be impeached, irregardless of what happens, because both sides want him to go. There are a lot of people who are starting to wake up to it, and members of Congress who are saying no. But at the end of the day, both the parties want to have that power. The Democratic Party wants the power to be able to unilaterally go to war. The Republican Party wants that power. And so to impeach a president over that would require that you're going to say this is going to be the standard operating procedure for the misuse of war powers. And neither party actually wants that. Now, you've got guys like Thomas Massey and Justin Amash and Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, who are out there pushing against this stuff and saying, we do not want it. And they're honest when they say they don't want to go, and they're going to fight it. but there's no way right now they would have the ability to do that because party leadership on both sides would quash it.
Now, does the establishment not understand that if you did something like that geopolitically, what that would do to our reputation around the world, and not only that, would possibly bring in a larger, I guess, a larger war in that region and completely destabilize the region? Or do you think that they just don't care?
I'm not sure if they care, and certainly they would have to realize, the dangers of what this means, especially when Syria is not Iraq and Syria is not Libya. So you were able to get away with that in some of those instances. But I also think that Russia and China watching the United States are far more emboldened than they were even 2 or 3 years ago right now. So the U.S., I think, around the world looks pretty weak. I think we look increasingly weak. But I think the way to look strong is not to say, well, then we need to bomb someone else to demonstrate that we're strong. And that seems to be what we keep hearing is, the rest of the world thinks we're weak, so we better blow somebody up. No, maybe we ought to step back and say it is this, kind of imperialistic empire building that is making us look weak around the world, especially when we're completely bankrupt and we're attempting to do it.
It's so sick. And then Bernanke just announced today he's going to continue QE infinity and beyond, or whatever it is now. So, I mean, just inflating our currency even more and more. So it's going to end. I don't mean to say like it's going to end, but all empires end when they run out of money, ladies and gentlemen, and that's where we're headed. So, it's really sad. I was hoping you were going to give me some kind of glimmer of hope there that we wouldn't trot off to war as we do all these times when there's any kind of political distraction or any kind of rumblings of an economic downturn. It seems to be the default reaction of these people is to trot us off to the war and distract us, but now we're in a position where the distractions aren't working anymore, and it's becoming, less and less, I guess, an easy pill for me to swallow that we might actually go and do this. So it's...
Well, hold on. But let me say this, because I'm a guy who goes around telling people that liberty is rising.
Absolutely.
And I believe that it is. So let me give you some hope. Even if on in this occasion we do wind up, firing missiles into Syria, and we might not, but even if it does happen, we should still be excited about the idea that it has been postponed, it has been delayed, it has been held back by an American public and an alternative media.
Absolutely.
So that's a huge victory. And I don't want people, if something does happen where we still move forward on this and there is, a cruise missile strike against Damascus at some point, don't feel like, here we go again. Not necessarily. I think that the public's in a different place, and I think we have better information. So that's positive. And also, I would say this, when we talk about the Federal Reserve, we talk about the printing of money, the buying of bonds, we talk about the really difficult place that the U.S. is in right now. One thing I want to encourage people in is whatever community you're in, really start to work to build out within your local community like-minded people who have similar beliefs and values, and start building community with those people. Because if the system at some point does crash, and if we end up in a really bad position where economically the nation crashes, you're going to need to be in a strong community. You're going to need to be with people that you can depend on and count on. So don't wait until it looks like it's all falling down to start developing that community. You need to start developing that community now, because if the republic comes crashing down, someone's going to have to rebuild it. And we know the system that we're in right now is unsustainable, but that also means that if it comes down, it can be built back up again. And so that's only going to happen if we're in strong communities. And I really want to encourage people in that.
Absolutely. And also encourage, people to listen to this broadcast and to check out your site to educate other people. I mean, if you have this information and you understand what Ben and I are talking about here, it's almost your, I guess, I don't want to say patriotic duty because that sounds very statist, but it is almost to the point where it's almost a self-preservation that you need to get as many people aware of this information, like Ben said, and tuned into what's going on, so that if something like he says cruise missiles do go in, then we can really put constituent pressure on the politicians and really change the narrative up there. Because if there's one thing that politicians really love, and that's what the constituents want to hear, and they will do whatever you want to say because, man, do they like being elected, and they love that big chair. So the more pressure we can put on them and use the political tools that we have at our disposal, I think the better off we're going to be. So, Ben, we got a few more minutes here with you. I think we got 15 minutes left. Front and center on your radar screen, what's big with benswann.com right now?
Well, we're actually going to be releasing a piece tomorrow at noon on Monsanto and crony capitalism. We're going to be talking about the relationship between Monsanto and government, and talking about some of the, in general, some of the concerns that people have. But really, at the end of the day, I think Monsanto, more than anything else, whether you like GMOs and you think they're fine, or you're worried about them, there are people on both sides of that argument. One thing that's undoubtable is the relationship between government and the private sector, that it just doesn't work. And so you got all these people in this country who are concerned about capitalism. Capitalism's evil and capitalism's bad. Capitalism's not bad. Crony capitalism is very bad. And crony capitalism, which another term for it is fascism, is a terrible, terrible system in government. And yet that's the system that we have right now. So we're going to be talking about that. It'll be released tomorrow at noon. And also we do have a story we put out today that's getting a lot of traffic. It's a school that's actually, it was a child who took a test at a school, and the question had to do with the constitutionality of a police officer confiscating a gun from someone who has a permit if they're pulled over at a traffic stop. And the student said, no, they didn't have the right under the Constitution. And the teacher marked that answer as incorrect and said, yes, they do have the right. And so that story's up there right now. You should check it out. A lot of people are clicking on it and looking at it. I don't think it's terribly surprising, but it's very unfortunate. And it's something that, again, we've got to work to change those things.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've got a screen viewer or something, but that was actually the next question on my agenda. So now that does really raise an interesting point of view when you do talk about government running our education system in general, and then the new standards and practices they're going to come out with their new Common Core. Is this going to be a quote Common Core? I guess. Is this going to be one of their prongs to Common Core? Is rewriting the Constitution, or interpreting it, or taking it out of context and then publishing that into books? Because you did pull out the other one here, and I'm just looking at the article that I think was it in Texas, that they had the Second Amendment says that the people have a right to keep and bear arms in a state militia, which is not what it says at all.
Not at all what it says.
Now, do you homeschool your kids, correct?
I do. Correct.
Okay, great. Now, what would you say about Common Core? Do you know enough about Common Core to comment? Is this something that people should be actively trying to resist, or is this something that? Go ahead.
Yeah, they absolutely should be. Listen, I've actually done some stuff on Common Core in the past, and Common Core is essentially set up. It was originally set up to just create common test standards around the country. And, there's been a lot of independent work on it, and folks who have looked at it and said it's a race to the middle. A lot of states had to actually lower their testing standards in order to fit the Common Core kind of setup. The idea is it was promoted by the National Governors Association, but it turns out it's not a bunch of governors signed on to it. That's just a trade organization out of D.C. It's actually funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Common Core originally started out as just, we want to create common testing so everyone's on the same page. Well, now it's, of course, as with all these things, has shifted over to curriculum. And so Common Core has actually been around now for about 5 years, I believe. But it's only recently really started picking up steam in terms of the pushback, because they've now moved over to curriculum, saying that we're going to create a single kind of curriculum that will run throughout the whole country. And, there's a lot of issues with this. And it goes back to, how much say do parents, local school districts, teachers have in curriculum. And I think they should have a say. And right now they certainly don't. This will make it much worse.
But isn't that, oh my God, as you mentioned fascism, and lo and behold, we run into another, great form of fascism slash communism, and that would be government control of education. Um, are we really turning into the United Soviet States here? I mean, this is really what it looks like with the crony capitalism on one side, the federal government control of education on another side. Are we turning into a modern day Soviet Union, perhaps?
Well, I think the Soviets in many ways wanted to have the kind of power that's being used in the U.S. right now, but they didn't have the technology.
Mm-hmm.
The technology today allows government to watch every single thing that you do, to
Mm-hmm.
monitor all of your activities, and it's almost impossible to get away from them. And there is this relationship between the private sector and businesses and government, corporations and government. So you have right now a lot of people upset about Apple and their fingerprint scanner, and
Mm-hmm.
saying don't get involved with that. And more and more we're seeing that collusion, and it's not a good thing. It's a very dangerous thing. And I think a lot of people, especially folks who candidly, grew up during the Cold War and watched the Soviets, and they were fearful of them and thought to themselves, I'm so glad I'm not over there and I'm over here. I think those people must be struggling to say, well, where are we right now?
Absolutely, and that was one of the things that I made a comment on after the NSA stuff broke, and I was one of those, evil, weird people that actually read the Telecommunications Act and understood what I worked in telecom for about 3.5 years, and I had one of my engineers break down before this even all went public the different routers and switches that were used. And then when I would ask him the switch that was actually the AT&T box switch, that they didn't have a specific name for it, but it turns out that it was the NSA filter that went right behind the AT&T box. He would just basically say, "Well, that's another switch." I'm like, "Well, who owns that switch?" He's like, "AT&T does, but I don't know what they do with it." And I'm like, "Oh, good Lord!" And then I saw the graph come out a couple of weeks ago with the NSA, and it showed the breakdown of how everything is captured in real time, and it made it kind of, I guess, really unsettling for me that you're exactly right. We're in a position now where there is no sense of privacy. And there was a famous hacker convention back in 2008 where the keynote speaker got up and said, and I guess they've known this for a while too, is that he said, you have no privacy, now get over it. So now we have to find ways to manipulate it. So what does the American public do now, trying to get all of these constitutional rights that are being violated, the basic founding document of our nation? What do we do, Ben? How do we push back on the system? And let's talk about solutions. Are there solutions to take down this, or to slay this, monolith that we have now called big government?
Well, I think there is a solution. I think the solution is, and I've been telling people this at a variety of different places around the country, but what I really want to encourage people in is to start working to dismantle the growing local government in your communities. So when you have, for instance, a mayor or a county commission or a city council that is accepting huge amounts of federal dollars to build streetcars, you need to get in there and remove those people from office. You've got to push back the same way that Agenda 21 is spread around the country is the same way that you can push back. But you've got to get involved. You've got to get liberty-minded people elected to local office. If you have a police chief who believes in policing for profit, who believes that red light cameras and traffic cameras are a way of generating revenue, so we need to give people as many tickets as possible in order to make money for our little village or our town or city, you need to replace your mayor and then fire your police chief. And so there is a process for that. I think that it has to happen there first. We talk a lot about the federal government, about the White House, about Congress, but candidly, even if you change those things, it's not going to really make your life more free unless we do something about what's going on the local level. And that's where the change has to begin. And it's happening. I was just in Minnesota this past weekend talking to Liberty, Minnesota, and got a chance to meet some of the great activists there who were working in different small towns and small communities around Minnesota who are really making these changes or making it happen. And that's how it has to happen. If you cannot manage as a group to work within your own community to say, well, we have a city council and a mayor who are spending all this money and they keep raising property taxes. And if you can't get control of that, how are you ever going to control what's happening on the federal level? You're never going to be able to.
And I think that one of the common defaults, and I not to divulge my day job to everybody, but I've talked about it before, but I do legislative research for an organization. That's my job, is to go out and poll people and to talk to people and to talk to business owners. And I do see a section of society that's pretty much given up. And my job, I guess, is, doing the job that I do, is to try to get people more politically involved in the process and show them that they can make a difference. And I think that that's something that I'm going to take to the bank, and that's to really encourage people to do things at the local level, because I think that when people think of government, they think of this big, the white buildings in Washington, the White House, the Capitol, all those things, and they're all grandiose, and it's just very intimidating, and people feel powerless. But I think that the more the people educate themselves, the more they're going to realize that those tools are there to make you feel powerless, so that you don't take action, so that you do exactly what you're doing, and that's sit around and wait for the FEMA trucks to come get you, or whatever their belief systems are. So, but Ben, thank you so much for the time. I would like for you to plug anything that you would like to plug here before we let you go, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
I really appreciate the time. Thanks so much.
Do you got a website other than benswann.com that people can find you at, or Facebook or Twitter? Do you have a Twitter handle?
You can do it on Facebook, facebook.com/Ben Swann Reality Check. You can also just, or